Sitting has resumed. Please be seated. We resume on item second reading of the Immigration Transition Bill 2018, item 1 on the bills. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. He's given way. He's given way. Are you accept? Fair enough. No, the member for Prospect.
Mr. Speaker, fellow members of the government bench, members of the Legislative Assembly, members of the listening public tuned in over the air or live on GIS TV, a special good evening to my constituents in Prospect, whom I have the pleasure to represent. I am again privileged and humbled to rise to address this honorable House on behalf of the Ministry of Human Resources, Immigration, and Community Affairs. Mr. Speaker, the primary objective of this coalition government is to achieve sustainable national security, social development, and economic prosperity for our people. In support of these goals, Mr. Speaker, as the Premier outlined in his moving of this motion, the Ministry has committed from the outset to implement policies and legislation intending to drive the evolution of law enforcement and border security, the employment of Caymanians, as well as a strategic reform of the approach towards migration management and workforce development. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Human Resources and Immigration, with the support of my unity government, has been steadfast in its execution of radical, and if I may be so bold to call it, revolutionary organizational change programs necessary to create a customer-centric efficiencies, improve transparency in our service delivery models, and to ensure tangible outcomes for Caymanians, residents, and businesses alike. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, our policies and strategic decisions for implementation have been rightly cited by some as ambitious. And that is something this administration makes no apologies for, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I'm reminded of a quote. I think it goes, "A dream without ambition is like a car without gas. You ain't going anywhere." Mr. Speaker, we are determined to continue taking this country into the future on a platform of ambitious policies and legislation underpinned by world-class strategies, services, programs, and partnerships. Mr. Speaker, to that end, two key policy decisions of this administration have been the establishment of the Workforce Opportunities and Residency Cayman Department and the establishment of the Customs and Border Control Agency. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, to hear both the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition give their support for this legislation, and it is my hope that their colleagues will also share in a similar viewpoint. But then again, why wouldn't they? This is something that we've all, in one way or the other, campaigned on. In respect to work, Mr. Speaker, this new entity will be charged in one aspect with managing the National Jobs Clearinghouse, which, for those young and young at heart techies within these hollowed halls and those listening in via the airways will recognize as an online hub that identifies Caymanians and those with the right to work, showcasing their qualifications and skills and experiences, such that businesses can match job opportunities against an otherwise available labor market or job pool. The Leader of the Opposition, as well as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in their contributions, questioned the relevance of incorporating permanent residency and Cayman status, whilst others in the public domain have even questioned the inclusion of work permits in the overall work mix. And may I attempt to answer it by simply stating that each of these work permits, permanent residence, Cayman status, represent an important labor characteristic that impacts both the job and labor landscape. For every job that a work permit holder, a permanent residence, or Cayman status holder occupies, it's one less job that the indigenous Caymanian will otherwise occupy. And therefore, when you are trying to strategically leverage and manage and shape your labor force, certainly you must be inclusive of all your labor partners and not just the Caymanians. As such, Mr. Speaker, work will be responsible for the continual modernization and the administration of work permits through solutions that improve our capability and the opportunity to protect against the commonly held disenfranchisement of Caymanians from accessing job opportunities. In other words, the long-held and somewhat accepted belief that Caymanians are in some way being discriminated against local job opportunities, for which you won't get much argument from me nor any other member of this administration. But again, this is why we believe, in one respect, being able to take a different approach to work permits and including it in the broader strategies of shaping our labor force. We will then protect against that disenfranchisement or that discrimination against Caymanians. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, this will provide the opportunity for responsive service delivery solutions to the businesses that legitimately require expatriate workers due to the long-held and commonly accepted fact that there is a limited supply of Caymanian labor. Moreover, it will allow us to provide these services and to approve these services at the speed of business versus the speed of sometimes that of a turtle, which businesses oftentimes complain about. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, as with work permits, the administration of applications for permanent residency and Caymanian status will be conducted by virtue of an efficient and secure online e-services platform. Now again, some of you in the room may notice a trend developing here. These new systems that will be embraced by work will embrace technology as a means to deliver greater efficiencies and effectiveness. Customers will find that we have radically re-engineered and streamlined the administrative requirements, processes, and procedures. At the same time, we will increase our capacity and capability to thoroughly vet applicants, quickly identify persons presenting risks, and respond to such threats to ensure public safety is not compromised in the context of migration management. Now, what does this mean? This means, in short, that not only will work be charged with the obligation of addressing the gaps in terms of employment for Caymanians, but at the same token, it will perform a degree of border security by ensuring, or better mitigating rather, the risk of importing crime into the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, work will develop strategic and operational solutions to generate and leverage labor market intelligence. Again, another big phrase, what does that mean, labor market intelligence? What are the jobs available? What are the jobs that are in high demand? What are the skills required to fulfill these jobs, and what are the skills gaps amongst Caymanians that are restricting them access to these jobs? We believe this function of the organization is vital in terms of supporting a healthy, well-functioning economy. This will also allow businesses, individuals, and training providers to make informed decisions and investments, as well as operational diversification, planning scholarships, what training programs to initiate both in-house and outside, as well as giving individuals the opportunity to better plan what their careers will look like from the onset. To date, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Human Resources and Immigration has recruited an interim director, many of you know, Ms. Sharon Rolston, who is steadily at the helm of this transition exercise. Ms. Rolston has now the support of 2 recently hired Caymanian deputies, as well as a project team that is comprised of members of this ministry and includes the Immigration Department, the National Workforce Development Agency, the Department of Labor and Pensions, the portfolio of the Civil Service, the e-government unit, the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, as well as various partners within the private sector. This holistic approach, we believe, Mr. Speaker, will support broad success in this important arena that previous administrations have tried to tackle with varying successes. It has truly been, in the last 15 months, I've been elected and privileged to be a part of this unity government, but specifically a member of the Ministry of Human Resources and Immigration. It has truly been an all-hands-on-deck type of attitude and spirit among those involved in the implementation of this policy. And that is despite of, or perhaps in spite of, the obvious complexities regarding technology, human resources, logistics, communication, and of course, let us not forget governance and legislation. So, how did we overcome this challenge, Mr. Speaker? Well, again, the ministry and the team led by Ms. Ralston have consulted widely within our community, to include the University College of the Cayman Islands students, the Small Businesses Business Association, the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce, the Caymanian Bar Association and Law Society, the Human Resources Society, the Cayman Islands Tourism Association, the Department of Tourism, the National Workforce Development Agency clients and staff, as well as the immigration clients and staff, in order to come up with a model, this model that we are today presenting, that we in the ministry believe will be successful in identifying and solving the problems that a small percentage of the overall population still face relative to employment in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, these intensive consultations over the better part of a year have guided the implementation of work, the Immigration Transition Bill, and the additional legislative and operational improvements that will come in the very near future. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am particularly excited about the developments that will come out of the new labor needs and supply functions of work. This section of work will provide valuable information, evidence-based information, as to the labor needs and the overall Caymanian labor force. This information will help drive work policies as well as help us to determine effective training and intervention programs as well as targeted employment initiatives. And I think this aspect is important and should not be missed, because some in this honorable House and without may ask what specific employment initiatives will focus on in terms of talent management that would otherwise lead to our Caymanians getting jobs, something that our people have also been crying out for a very long time. Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to answer that on behalf of the ministry. In the public domain, Mr. Speaker, and especially on the talk shows, many enjoy to draw the reference to the work permit regime and the commonly held belief that all of these jobs, or most of these jobs, should and or belong to Caymanians. It might surprise some, but I do not disagree with that statement or those sentiments. But why aren't these jobs going to Caymanians? Well, in a word, Mr. Speaker, skills, or a lack thereof. Through our year-long consultation, we have identified that over 70% of all work permits issued every year over 70% of the work permits issued every year are issued for jobs that Caymanians can do. Jobs such as computer technicians, air conditioner repair, plumbing, auto mechanics, as we've heard here this evening, tourism-related jobs, etc., etc., etc. 70% of the overall work permit issued in this country are in these areas. These are vocational jobs, Mr. Speaker, that require specific training. But at the end of that specific training, they offer persons the ability to occupy tangible careers. Careers that can not only open up pathways for employment, but also opportunities for entrepreneurship and, in other words, ownership. So now you can get trained in a vocation that is in high demand, you've got the skills, and now those skills enable you to monetize those skills as a business for yourself. Is that not what our goal and desire should be for all Caymanians, whether they elected us or not? Certainly why I ran for office is what I campaigned on, and I think, again, that a majority, if not all of us, campaigned on that platform. So why aren't more Caymanians in these vibrant and profitable fields? Well, Mr. Speaker, it's twofold, I think. I think part of it is culture and a belief that some of these jobs are beneath Caymanians. Now, I don't put a lot of stock in that argument, because when I look at the participation in the NICE programs or the presently ongoing iguana culling exercise, it proves to me that Caymanians who need work will do just about anything to get work and earn an honest day's living. We know that need only provide it. But another gap that prevents them from these jobs is specific targeted soft and hard skills. Skills, Mr. Speaker, that work in conjunction with its partners in the community, like the University College of the Cayman Islands, who provide, and I want to caveat this, who already provide a raft of vocational jobs that does not require the government to go down and build a building, put a sign up on the edge that says vocational training starts here. Everyone in this country is waiting for government and blaming government, saying, well, you're not training people vocationally, when in reality what we're not doing is communicating the availability of this vocational training that is available in the Cayman Islands. And again, I note most notably and congratulate the University College of the Cayman Islands, where there are at least 13 real-world vocational training programs available right now to all Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, having identified these hotspots, having identified where the majority of work permit jobs are going, and having identified that there are Caymanians able to fill them, we need only ask ourselves what is keeping Caymanians from those jobs, and we acknowledge them to be skills and training. And this is something that work can be more effective in addressing to ensure that all our people, regardless of their strata, can be a part of the Cayman dream. Now, again, these jobs, Mr. Speaker, have always been here, and so too have the opportunities. However, we have lacked the evidence-based systems upon which to strategically shape our labor markets, and instead have been happy to allow the economy to develop organically, fundamentally on its own, bowing to the wishes of one employment group or the other, versus having decided for ourselves, where are we going, where do we want to go, and how do we get there in order to ensure that our people get there with us. Well, unfortunately, despite enjoying an over 95% employment rate in the Cayman Islands and seeing unemployment cut in half since 2012, there still remains a few that have fallen between the cracks. And this is why I'm so excited about work, because, Mr. Speaker, I believe work and the systems that will underpin its operation and the legislative framework that we have put before this Honourable House will seek to achieve in a meaningful way. Mr. Speaker, with information decisions driving Caymanian talent management and development, we can better help Caymanians take up meaningful employment and then enable them to benefit from the economic growth that our country is currently experiencing, and by all indication, by the hard work of all of the ministers on the front bench, will continue to benefit from for the foreseeable future. Mr. Speaker, the Immigration Transition Bill clearly represents an integral component in this paradigm shift. It is, in fact, a necessary catalyst for the continued implementation of the policies and reforms underpinning and driven by the establishment of workforce opportunities, residency, Cayman. Mr. Speaker, without wishing to restate the points already so ably made by the Honourable Premier, I do want to record my full support for this Immigration Transition Bill. Mr. Speaker, this bill represents another opportunity to represent not only to my constituents and prospect, but to all of our constituents across the aisle, both the coalition government of national unity, the opposition, and the independent member, that your government is committed to delivering the solutions necessary to ensure equal opportunity for Caymanians, employment for Caymanians, and empowerment for Caymanians, whilst creating efficient, streamlined, and transparent mechanisms through which to facilitate a diverse, productive, and prosperous labour market. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for this opportunity to offer up my contributions to this debate on what I believe to be a vitally important initiative of my government. And I ask the members of this Honourable House to work with us to support this bill, and in so doing support our fellow Caymanian brothers and sisters, while also fulfilling promises that we all made during our election campaign, which pledged to improve the lives of the citizens that we are so fortunate to represent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give my contributions to the bill called the Immigration Transition Bill 2018. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that you award me the same latitude that has been given to all the members, because, Mr. Speaker, I see that this bill has become the Labour bill quite easily. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be here only to state my concerns about what has been discussed that is not necessarily relevant to this bill, but also to give my kudos to the government for taking the first couple of necessary steps in the right direction. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves yet, Mr. Speaker, because what I'm hearing in this debate so far, Mr. Speaker, quite reminds me of the baby father who wants to get credit for something they're supposed to do, like saying they pay the child support. Mr. Speaker, when I heard the contributions by the last member, a person who I respect, I had to say to myself, that all sounds well and good, but can you tell me how? Selling the dream of this pretty sunset without explaining exactly how you're going to do it sounds like the same old in politics. Mr. Speaker, the last member suggested talking about training opportunities for Caymanians and that there's so many offerings in Cayman, and I agree there's some offerings, but I think the government is failing to realize the hurdles that are stopping Caymanians from taking up those opportunities. And if you happen to get across those hurdles to take up those opportunities, Mr. Speaker, then you have the other hurdle, which the government hasn't proposed that they are addressing either, which is how to stop the tailor-making of ads to undermine Caymanians. So, Mr. Speaker, may I suggest some suggestions for the government to consider? Because though the work bill has yet to take under its control the labor law, or the labor law will be working under them, and they have said here tonight, Mr. Speaker, that they have intentions of bringing amendments to the labor law in the future, maybe a little bit of my contributions may help them in respect to, thank you, in respect to their proposals in the future. Now, Mr. Speaker, as a representative of the people of Georgetown Central, I'll try to give some narrative as to why some of my constituents aren't taking up the opportunities of training that the government says is available to them. Mr. Speaker, chances are people who are not trained or not up to par in their skill sets have a high probability of having difficulties in their own life. And chances are high possibility they didn't finish school or had an early pregnancy at a young age or don't have the support system at home like most families may have. So they have challenges. Chances are they may have a kid or they have to pay for their own rent and their own food and the like. And these are the people that sometimes people say, you need to go upskill yourself. But while they go and take these opportunities, Mr. Speaker, who's going to pay their bills? Who's going to pay for the rent? Mr. Speaker, I hear the elected member for Prospect suggesting that there's opportunities from the Needs Assessment Unit to pay for their bills while they're in training. Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe the member should get up and show me where that is an option in the Needs Assessment Unit, that when you're in a training program, that they'll pay for your rent, pay for your food, your light, and your water while you upskill yourself for the next 6 months or a year. Because, Mr. Speaker, most of the training opportunities that have been suggested, we've heard from members talk about, well, we don't want to give them a little certificate. We want to make sure that they're well qualified. And rightfully so. I agree. Because if you want to put them out into the business community, you want to say, I know this person has a legitimate 1-year course of training or 2 years, and whatever it may be, whether it's a UCCI associate's degree, whether it's electrical programming, because it's not as just simple as the hands-on work anymore. They want to know that you're computer illiterate, because no matter what you do, you have to have that skill set. And no program is going to be that short. I've yet to hear this administration talk about offerings to assist people that when they do take up those training opportunities, if they have the difficulties of not having the luxury of, say, a mother and a father who can provide for them, put a roof over their house and give them food and spending money while they're going through this, what are they supposed to do? Many of those unfortunate situations are in my constituency. Well, Mr. Speaker, I hear the member from Prospect talking about Passport for Success. That is one. And there's many different areas. There's many different areas, Mr. Speaker, upon which training opportunities are available. Now, I'll be happy to accept, Mr. Speaker, if the government is saying every training opportunity available for a Caymanian, that the government is willing to give them subsidies while they are training full-time to take care of their bills. The cost of living in Cayman is quite high, Mr. Speaker, and even when you have a job, it's hard to take care of those bills. These are some of the things that I believe the government can initiate to help more persons taking advantage of the training programs. Now, I can't say with an honest heart that the administration hasn't improved over the last 5 to 6 years of more training opportunities. The Honorable Premier has said that in his strategic policy statement, and he listed out a number of training programs, and I had to, as a representative of the people, go, well, what is it that is causing the people not to take up these opportunities? Because he's right, they're there. But what do I say to a single mother in Georgetown Central with 2 children who barely can find a job at minimum wage now to say, listen, drop what you're doing and go off and train yourself for a year? Who's going to pay for the Pampers? Who's going to put the milk? Honestly speaking, if you want to give them a chance, you have to be able to take and help them as they retrain and retool themselves. Every other jurisdiction, every other first world country understands that and recognizes it. Even our own mother country recognizes that. In the UK, whenever you go off for training and they want to, you go through the system of the social welfare. One of the structures are, if you want to retrain yourself, they will help you and get you to that point and pay for the necessary skill sets out there for you to survive, pay for the necessary bills for you until you're upskilled, and then they put you back out into the work market. Now, if that's something that the government can say that they're already doing, please highlight it so my constituents can take advantage of it, because they're not aware of it. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's one of the hurdles that I find it's in the way of that dream that the good member was speaking about. And Mr. Speaker, the good member also used a really good abbreviation. He said, and I like it, a dream without ambition is like a car without gas, and it's not going anywhere. But Mr. Speaker, what the member has forgotten that is a car also uses oil. And for me, Mr. Speaker, that oil is the lack of legislation change here for discussion. Because we're talking about labor in all of these changes, and it's not even here yet. All this bill is, Mr. Speaker, is adding the Immigration Department to what we now know as the National Workforce Development Agency and changing up the names. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to give the benefit of the doubt to this administration that there are things to come. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and I can't give credit to something that has not happened yet. I am hoping that the government is successful in finding the solutions, because when they win, my people win. But I haven't heard that. All I heard was a pie in the sky, bunch of fluffy words talking about this dream, and I see no action yet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me get on to the second hurdle that is in the way of the people of the Cayman Islands, which again is not in this bill. Because, Mr. Speaker, this bill is rather huge, but I would say that 90% of it is actually that other half of immigration that is not going to customs that is attached to this. Let me, just for the listening audience's sake, tell you how many pages that actually talks about work. Now, before I do that, I want to give full support to the Premier and his administration in respect to the immigration stuff. I think that they are going in the right direction, even though my good colleague from East End highlighted some concerns which I support, but I think we're going in the right direction into dealing with immigration matters. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the parts of the National Workforce Development Agency that has been taken and added to this bill, or the more labor-related parts of the bill. And as I look at it, even though one would argue that immigration kind of has a lot to do with work anyway, but if we're just talking about the labor stuff that was there and not what is being brought over from immigration, it's about 3 pages. The rest of it is just straight from Immigration Department. And, Mr. Speaker, I am one of my key concerns in this country, Mr. Speaker, is labor and protection of fair opportunities for Caymanians. And let me repeat, Mr. Speaker, one of my major concerns is protection for Caymanians to have fair opportunities in this country. That means if they have if they've worked hard, if they've proven themselves, they've trained themselves, that we should eliminate any loopholes or malicious behavior or practices within the work market to undermine those Caymanians. And, Mr. Speaker, one of the ways that I was hoping that even though we were talking about the labor bill in the last our last couple of speakers talking about labor bill, and we're not really even gotten there to that place yet with that bill to come to this House, I thought since that door was open, let me walk through it. And when we talk about protecting Caymanians, one of the things that I noticed that is in this bill talks about officers, and let me go to exactly where that location is in the bill. It says in Part 2, Section 8(3), it says, appointment of officers of work. Officers appointed under subsection 1 may include officers called compliance officers who shall have the function of carrying out investigations in relations to any matter under this law, whether or not involving an alleged offense, in respect of which the work exercises function under this law or any other law. Well, without the labor bill being changed, I don't know what they're going to investigate, Mr. Speaker. Because the truth of the matter is, in this country, the person who, or the entity who determines who is qualified for any job in this country, in my view, is the employer. Now, that's a bittersweet situation, Mr. Speaker. Let me talk about the sweet first. I understand that we cannot stranglehold employers in this country. Employers must be able to be given the right talent pool to be successful in their business. And nobody's saying that that shouldn't be done. Matter of fact, I think all members of the opposition and the government supports that theory. But what we're not putting in place is stopping the loopholes for those other employers, the ones who want to undermine Caymanians for a various number of reasons. And let's talk about those reasons, Mr. Speaker. Realistically speaking, it is easier to get somebody on work permit and potentially pay them less, because we don't control the wages amounts. So you may have somebody who is willing to come here because it's a lot more that they make here than where the country of origin they're from. So chances are they'll work for less. When under the work permit regime, as we speak, the control that the employer has is so severe, no work permit holder will ever dare challenge the employer because they know they'll be out of work. That control is a very attractive control for many employers. And the other element of how do we secure to make sure that these people are who they say they are, qualified the way they say they are, or whether or not they have records across the world which Caymanians are exposed to. You have to have a police record for everything. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was on to the point of the bitter and the sweet of the employers. And I just highlighted why some employers will find it more in favor to hire a person on work permit. And it's not like we can stop the work permits. We have more jobs here in the Cayman Islands than we have Caymanians. So we all recognize that we need the work permit holders, but we have to create a balanced system that Caymanians are the ones to take advantage of the jobs first. Anything left over, any gravy, any crumbs, anybody wants to come on down to our beautiful country. We love and respect you, the Cayman kind. That's what we do. That's what we're supposed to do. But what we're failing in is making sure that the Caymanians come first. And I'm going to show you how, Mr. Speaker. Because when I highlighted the fact of the malicious employers who don't want to have Caymanians in those positions because of the various reasons, whether control or lack of pay and others. The Caymanians, forgive me, Mr. Speaker, I lost my frame of thought there, but the employers who don't want Caymanians because of those various reasons that they don't have those controlled, they are more willing to be the type who would tailor-make ads to undermine the Caymanians for those reasons. And I'm going to show you how they get away with it. When it's time to decide for a job, forgive me, Mr. Speaker. When it's time to decide for a job, whichever job it may be, who is the authority in this country that decides what qualifications is needed for each job? It's not the National Workforce Development Agency, and currently, as the legislation states, it's not the Workforce Opportunities for Residency for Cayman. But I know the government is going to argue that. They're going to say, our board can decide to say, well, whether we don't really think so, that a Caymanian actually has the same qualification. But where is the threshold of comparison? Where is the measure of what is truly a qualification for any post in this country? Where's the national list to say that the business community and the government has agreed that a job for a secretary equals this? Because until the government and the private sector come together and decide what the job criteria is for every single post in this country, it will always be subjective and it will always be an appeal process. Now, you may have heard, Mr. Speaker, of my colleague talking about setting up such a list when he was alluding to part of my debate. And I want to take this opportunity now to go to my manifesto that I campaigned on in 2017. I proposed to the people of Georgetown Central that I would create what I called a national standard job criteria list. And what that is, Mr. Speaker, is that we go through all the jobs in this country from entry level to middle management. And I'll explain why I stopped at middle management, Mr. Speaker, in a minute. But go through every single one of those lists and make it something that we have a select committee of persons in the business community and representatives from the department like work, and at that time it was the National Workforce Development Agency, and we sit down and we go through each individual job in this country and say, okay, realistically speaking, what is the criteria for somebody who pumps gas? And we decide together. So there will be no discrepancies when the Labor Department says, nope, that criteria don't work. And then the employer comes back and say, but you can't tell me what I need for my job. And then the employer challenges that, and then it comes subjective. Who decides it? And until we get together and sit down and say, this is what it is, when that list is created and it becomes a national document, then there's no questions anymore, because that Caymanian can say this is something that the private sector has sat down with and agreed that a gas pump attendant is simply this: a high school diploma, can read, and physically able to lift 50 pounds. Let's just say that that was the criteria list that was agreed upon by private sector, whether that private sector is Chamber of Commerce or what have you, and the National Workforce Development Agency, which is going to be worked shortly. Yeah, they sat down together and say, okay, this is what we agree on. So they know that when they put out an application for that, if a Caymanian meets those criteria, it's no more questions anymore about whether or not the Caymanian is going to get the job, because the Caymanian already knows that they have that job because they have those qualifications. But somebody, and in this case, without that list, that national list for us to compare to, what ends up happening is the employer says, I need him to know the science of gas technology. I need him to be able to speak Spanish. I need him to be able to cash out the monies, even though he's not dealing with the cash register. He's only dealing with the pumping of the gas and handing the cash to the cash register. And he stipulates all of these different points because he wants a work permit holder he can pay less or control or whatever reason they have specified for that work permit holder. Not specifically just because the person can do the job. So they get to manipulate and tailor-make that situation. Now, is it reasonable? Is it not okay to sit down with the private sector and say, listen, come on, let's get together and figure out each one of these posts? Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll say that I know that there is a list already out there that the Immigration Department has been using for various different posts for comparison. But the problem for me, Mr. Speaker, is two things. One, it's not a national document that Caymanians can go look at and see if they meet the requirements. And secondly, the private sector hasn't had any influence of that document to say whether they agree with it or not. Because until you get an agreement with government and private sector as to what is qualified for any one post, there will always be an argument. There will always be an appeal, because the private sector say you can't control what I need. I don't necessarily agree with that. But I believe that they should have a say into the type and quality of expectations for any job they put out for advertisement. But there's no negotiations with that. And here's what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker, until we do that. Here's what's going to potentially always be available to happen. It will always be a decision of some person, some human being in an office somewhere that somebody can call on the phone and say, listen, I need this one to go through, bypass this one and make sure the work permit get through. Until it becomes a public document where all the sunlight in the world can see it, wait, and no more questions to say, listen, I'm a Caymanian, I met those requirements, this is the national list, we all agreed upon it, the private sector, the government, and the people of this country, this is the document, see my resume here, they match up, you cannot do anything about that, you have to give me the job, or you don't hire nobody. Until we get to that stage, there's always going to be opportunity for corruption. Now, I want to make it clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm not suggesting that there's anybody corrupt in the civil service at this point. But we got to close the potential opportunity of that being able to happen. Some may even think it does happen. But it's not for me to suggest because I have no evidence of the sort. But if it's subjective, that means there's an opportunity. And I don't think if we had a national list, there would be any subjectivity. It'd be straight factual. Now, Mr. Speaker, I told you before that I said my suggestion in respect to this national standard job creation list was from entry level to middle management. And I stopped at middle management particularly for a reason, that business owners start to decide after middle management on different criteria on how they hire people. Then the soft skills and the attitude and the approach to business comes more into play. And that one you really can't put on a resume, so to speak. You only feel that one out based on interviews, based on the way you speak, the way you carry yourself, the likability of the person, the sternness of the person, the attitude, the drive, potentially a particular sentence or a quiz that you gave them. So I believe private sector need to have more leeway in respect to deciding what kind of person they want. And it's not only simply the criteria of, like, say, for instance, I am a certified accountant, or I'm an electrician, or what have you. When you go up to managerial levels, some other skills come into play. But in respect to entry-level jobs, straight up to middle management, I think there needs to be a national list. And until we get that, Mr. Speaker, where we can hold those who try to manipulate the system to account, we'll always forever have this problem. But then again, Mr. Speaker, we're not there yet, because that's not what we're discussing today. And Mr. Speaker, I was earlier when the opposition leader spoke and the deputy opposition leader spoke, I was quite willing to just not speak and just support the bill, because the truth of this bill is just a merger of parts of the immigration department with parts of the National Workforce Development Agency. There hasn't been much changes. The changes have yet to come. The government has said that themselves. So why are we talking about this pie in the sky and talking about how great it's going to be until we actually see the proof in the pudding? It's pointless. Because I think, Mr. Speaker, that we all agree already that we want to merge working responsibilities by way of government and the management of it with the granting of work permits process, two of them to merge together. I think we're all in agreement with that. So that's all this bill is offering based on what I can see. And it talks about, as a matter of fact, let me just read a little bit more of the bill itself, Mr. Speaker. On part 2, it talks the workforce opportunities and residency for Cayman Department. It says, functions of work include the following: providing the government and to the private sector labor market demands, assessments, training and development for Caymanians, and prescribed persons for workforce, providing a job, matching and placement service for Caymanians who are seeking jobs. It talks about all the things that we hope to do. And it goes through a lot of list of things, and I'm not going to bother to read through all the hopes and dreams of the bill, but I'm still waiting to see the strategies of exactly how to get to that dream that they've written down in this bill. Because there's been a lot of dreams, Mr. Speaker, that's been written in a lot of bills that I still see have not come to fruition. So, Mr. Speaker, now that I've done beating up on the administration, let me start talking about the positives. Mr. Speaker, say again? Okay. Okay. Well, I see that, you know when you got worries when they don't talk about you no more. So I'm glad you're speaking about me, my friend. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that I agree with what the members on this side have suggested already, including the opposition leader, the deputy opposition leader, and the member for East End. But until we actually start to hit the nitty-gritty of the labor bill and put in the proper reform that the government speaks about in respect to the labor bill, this will be no different than a simple merger of two departments or parts of one department with another. And I genuinely, Mr. Speaker, believe the government is on the way to getting something done. But let's not blow our trumpets too early. We still got a lot of proving to do, Mr. Speaker. Because I've yet to hear about two of the biggest hurdles that I see every single day in and out in my constituency that harms my constituents from getting the opportunity to feed themselves, their kids, and their families. And we have a great economy. Whichever administration want to take credit for that, it doesn't matter. The fact is that things are doing a little bit better. But now it's time that we fix the economy and the global markets are doing okay and things seems to be positive. Now it needs to be positive for Caymanians and making sure that those we have left behind are put up front. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to remind this administration that today was the registration of the NICE program at the Lion Center. And until we have a day when we offer up such a program and nobody shows up because they're all working and they're all trained, I don't think we should be tooting our horn too much. And I look forward to hearing from the administration, like the Premier, the Honorable Premier has said, in the early part of next year with those changes. Because I thought that those changes would have been in this bill, but no, it's not. So I look forward to that because that means that there's still hope, that they will do the right thing and put in the right structures to, and I'm not afraid to use this word, protect Caymanians. Plenty of people say, stop saying that, it sounds protectionism, like you're anti everybody else. Well, I don't know about those of you who've been elected, but I was elected to protect Caymanians. Matter of fact, my manifesto says, together we can protect Caymanians. That's the first sentence in my manifesto. So I'm here to protect them. And I want to see legislation that will do so in the most important way of life, and that's to be able to put food on your table, keep a roof over your head. There's too many young Caymanians coming back home from university who are at home without a job for no legitimate reason whatsoever. And if the government wants to see them, I can be happy to come and make a march down by the government building sometime next week when we're out. So challenge me if you like, because they're out there. And I think this administration knows that, so does the opposition. Chance to do it now. The reform, I believe in it, and I believe that this administration could do it. But don't come to this legislative assembly, Mr. Speaker. I hope the government doesn't come to this honorable house with a lot of fluff. The people are sick of fluff. Caymanians work too hard to put their children through school, to come back and hear excuses. What's the point of the economy if the Caymanians are not the beneficiaries of it? What's the point of a Caymanian civil servant and their spouse work so hard, don't get no scholarship, spend $50,000 in university fees, and when the children come home, they can't get a job? What's the point? They put us here to do a job. I know I came to do mine. Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for the contribution. I look forward to the future debate on the labor bill. That's probably one of the top 3 bills in this country that needs to be focused on. And I will give the government full support if they put the necessary things in place to create fair, balanced opportunities for the business community so they can have the right skill sets to allow our work market to improve. But they can't be at the cost of those who genuinely, and I say genuinely because I know there's a lot of Caymanians out there who just don't want to do nothing. I know plenty of them. But that's still up for us to inspire them to change their attitude. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about the ones who genuinely want an opportunity, genuinely are undermined from an opportunity because of these little things like you can pay a work permit holder a little bit cheaper, or you can control the work permit holder a little bit better, or you can get more working hours out of them without paying them, or you're not going to be worried about them going to labor board. Those are the type of things that scare malicious employers. And I say malicious employers because there's a lot of great employers. And for those of you who are listening tonight, I thank you so much for continuing to do your part in our community and not being like those other ones. Because those persons who continue to undermine Caymanians are ruining our future and your business as well. We all have a part to play in the growth of this great country called Cayman Islands. And they should use their moral compass and do the right thing. Even though sometimes they're the hard-hit Caymanians, you got to do your job. This is Cayman. This is where you came to make success. Just can't come and ignore everybody. That's not how it works. So that being said, Mr. Speaker, I hope I didn't scare too many of those who are listening. But I know my tone of my delivery tonight was exactly the same of the tone of my delivery when I was campaigning, and I'm not going to change it, Mr. Speaker. They elected me based on this tone, based on this theory, based on this attitude, and I will continue that until the people of Georgetown Central say different. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to the future bill in labor. Thank you.
The member from Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to lend my contribution to this Immigration Transition Bill 2018 that is currently on the floor. One of the things I want to read, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I sent you a copy in advance. It was part of an article that was published in the Foreign Affairs magazine in November-December 2016 issue. And I can always get copies available for members afterwards. When I bought that magazine, Mr. Speaker, it was just prior to the US election in 2016. And as I was leafing through that magazine and looking at the different stories, one of them actually caught me. And it is that portion of that story I want to touch on. But before I do that, I just want to touch on the half of the editorial that started out explaining what that particular copy would have done. And this, like I said, Mr. Speaker, was prior to the US election. And what jumped out at me is that at that time, all the polls had Hillary Clinton leading, saying that there was no path for Donald Trump, but then there was a story that was written by Fareed Zakaria that had said otherwise. And a person of his standing to be going against the polls kind of really caught my attention. And I don't remember which airport I was, but it was one of those books that I decided to read as I was traveling. The editorial starts out, "The Power of Populism." And it says, on November 8, scores of millions of voters will cast their ballots for the most remarkable presidential candidate in the history of American politics. A charismatic real estate developer turned reality TV star whose strident populism and checkered past have been denounced even by many in his own party. Last June, meanwhile, defying most of the country's establishment, a majority of voters in the United Kingdom opted to abruptly exit the European Union, throwing the region's future into chaos. And elsewhere in Europe, surging populist parties now control parliamentary majorities or pluralities in 6 countries and sharing government in 3 others. What tectonic shifts are generating these earthquakes? How and why has populism emerged with a vengeance in the heart of the advanced industrialized world, and what will happen next? These are the questions we try to answer in this issue's lead package, drawing as usual on a broad range of experts from various perspectives. The package kicks off with a fascinating interview with Marie Le Pen, the second-generation leader of France's National Front, Western Europe's flagship populist party, who endorses Donald Trump, defends the Burkina ban, and calls for a Frexit, which is, in other words, France's exit from the European Union. Then Fareed Zakaria surveys the West populist revival, arguing that its roots lie in the convergence of opinion on economic policy, the divergence of opinion on culture, and a pushback against increased immigration. Mr. Speaker, there is a section in Fareed Zakaria's article entitled "Nation versus Migration." And it says, unsurprisingly, the initial and most important issue Trump exploited was immigration. On many other social issues, such as gay rights, even right-wing populists are divided and recognize that the tide is against them. Few conservative politicians today argue for the recriminalization of homosexuality, for instance, but immigration is an explosive issue on which populists are united amongst themselves and opposed to their elite antagonists. There is a reality behind the rhetoric, for we are indeed living in an age of mass migration. The world has been transformed by the globalization of goods, services, and information, all of which have produced their share of pain and rejection. But we are now witnessing the globalization of people, and public reaction to that is stronger, more visceral, and more emotional. Western populations have come to understand and accept the influx of foreign goods, ideas, art, and cuisine, but they are far less willing to understand and accept the influx of foreigners themselves. And today, there are many of those to notice. For the vast majority of human history, people lived, traveled, worked, and died within a few miles of their birthplace. In recent decades, however, Western societies have seen influxes of people from different lands and alien cultures. In 2015, there were around 250 million international migrants and 65 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Europe has received the largest share, 76 million immigrants, and it is the continent with the greatest anxiety. That anxiety is proven a better guide to voters' choices than issues such as inequality or slow growth. As a counterexample, consider Japan. The country has had 25 years of sluggish growth and is aging even faster than others, but it doesn't have immigrants. And in part, as a result, it does not caught the populist fever. Levels of public anxiety are not directly related to the total number of immigrants in a country.
Mr. Speaker, a point of order, sir.
A point of order.
I've listened patiently for 10 minutes, but the relevance of the member's speech to the bill at hand escapes me.
You, honorable member, you want to
Yeah, I will.
show the relevance of
yeah,
what
I
you're-
will. And apologies, Mr. Speaker. It will soon become clear. And
honorable member, you're going to have to make it quick.
yeah, I will get there, Mr. Speaker. And the reason I want to touch it, Mr. Speaker, just to put it in context for the honor. I know that's fine. I understand that. That's cool. The reason I want to touch this, while I'm reading this, Mr. Speaker, before I get into the real crux, is that this has always been immigration itself has been an emotive issue for our people. And labor has also been a very sensitive issue. And we're now combining both. And it is one of those issues that I can tell you from my own personal experiences of working for multinational corporations, from Arthur Anderson, who's, well, they're no longer around, Cable and Wireless, HSBC, Digicel, and even serving as a member of the business staff and plan board. I think my private sector experience in a previous life has given me a little bit of a view that some members may not have. And one of the things that I've noticed itself with immigration is that it has become one of those issues that a lot of leaders like to play on people's fears with it. And I think it's important for us here in the Cayman Islands, who have built a successful economy where we have embraced a lot of diversity, to make sure that we yield the temptation of getting into these emotive issues and recognize that we do need some level of leadership and some level of compassion on the issue. And I was... No, leaders. And the thing about it is, which I will continue, Mr. Speaker, and then you can understand, Mr. Premier, it will become clearer to you as we go. So just understand the politics of it. The point of order to slow me down, but let me continue. Thank you. No, but that's fine. Levels of public anxiety are not directly related to the total number of immigrants in a country or even to the concentration of immigrants in different areas, and polls show some surprising findings. The French, for example, are relatively less concerned about the link between refugees and terrorism than other Europeans, and negative attitude towards Muslims have fallen substantially in Germany over the past decade. One of the things I just want to close off on, Mr. Speaker, is where he ends by saying, immigration is the final frontier of globalization. It is the most intrusive and disruptive because as a result of it, people are dealing not with objects or abstractions. Instead, they come face to face with other human beings, ones who look, sound, and feel different. And this can give rise to fear, racism, and xenophobia. But not all the reaction is noxious. It must be recognized that the pace of change can move too fast for society to digest. The ideas of disruption and creative destruction have been celebrated so much that it's easy to forget that they look very different to the people being disrupted. Western societies will have to focus directly on the dangers of too rapid cultural change that might involve some limits on the rate of immigration and on the kinds of immigrants who are permitted to enter. It should involve much greater efforts and resources devoted to integration and assimilation, as well as better safety nets. Most Western countries need stronger retraining programs for displaced workers, ones more on the scale of the GI Bill, easily available to all, with government, the private sector, and educational institutions all participating. More effort also needs to be devoted to highlighting the realities of immigration so that the public is dealing with facts and not phobias. But in the end, there is no substitute for enlightened leadership, the kind that, instead of pandering to people's worst instinct, appeals to their better angels. Eventually, we will cross this frontier as well. The most significant divide on the issue of immigration is generational. Young people are the least anxious or fearful of foreigners of any group in society. They understand that they are enriched economically, socially, culturally by living in diverse, dynamic countries. They take for granted that they should live in an open and connected world, and that is the future they seek. The challenge for the West is to make sure that the road to the future is not so rocky that it causes catastrophe along the way. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you off the bat, and I may get in trouble for what I'm about to say, I actually support this move that the government is doing for two particular reasons. One, we can't continue business as usual. Doing nothing is not an option. And two, Mr. Speaker, and this may be a little bit different, but I am happy to some extent that the process to fill some of the positions in this new department is a challenge. Mr. Speaker, I've said time and time again that the same thinking that got us into this trouble can't be the same thing that's going to get us out. And if the government had basically taken every employee from both departments and stick them in this new department, I would not have supported this bill. Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, our issue and challenge in this country has never really been legislation. It has always been enforcement. And we do have to recognize that within the public service, we do have mismatch of skills to what is required for the general public. We have a department now that is expected to regulate the employment of the private sector. But you do need people who understand how the private sector works. You can't have career people who have been in the public service all their lives who do not understand some of the tricks and the trades that employers go through to get a permit through, trying to monitor them, because we'll be at a disadvantage. So I am happy to see that there is keen interest being paid on the people that we're recruiting in those positions. Equally so, I will say to the government, your first clients are going to be considered for success, are going to be some of the displaced workers who are going to be casualties of this merger. For the simple fact that you also have to prove to the Caymanian people and the public that those people can be retrained and a place found for them or an opportunity found for them somewhere within the public service that can match their skills and their talents. Because if you can't get your own house in order, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you the credibility factor in dealing with the private sector is going to be an issue. Mr. Speaker, my good friend from Savannah has always been the moral compass for the opposition. And I want to add in Exodus 23, verse 9, that says, "Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourself know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt." Many of us, Mr. Speaker, come from diverse backgrounds. And at some point along the way, my father, like many fathers, went to sea. And we know what diversity is about. We went away and people treated many Caymanians well. I've heard very few complaints. I take my own family experiences also, Mr. Speaker, where the Cayman Islands welcomed my grandmother 80 years ago, and my father 20 years after she arrived. So I know what it is like even as a second-generation Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, you know my wife. She's a big fan of yours. And I can tell you... No. They go way back, you know. And the thing about it is, I can tell you...
The member from Eastern is jealous.
That's all right. Well, I tell you what, but I tell you, Mr. Speaker, his stock is rising because that beef that he drops off her, I can tell you, his stock is going up. But you guys expect you were campaigning against her husband the last time, you know, what do you expect? But, Mr. Speaker, the thing about it is, if we're going to be brutally honest, because I can tell you right now, from my personal experience, Caymanians with the right attitude that are looking for a job, I have no problem finding them a job. I can say that from my personal experience. There's one young man I can tell you that came back from university and came back with the usual bravado and everything else. And I had to have a come to Jesus talk with him. Sat down, I called a friend of mine and I said, you know, interview this young man for me and just give me feedback. So I told him basically he went in for an interview for a job, but that was more for me to understand what kind of person I was working with. Person called him back and said, Chris, I would not hire this young man because his attitude sucks. And I came out from school, no experience, but figure more or less, you know, I have a degree, I'm entitled to a job. And nothing is wrong with having that approach. But we need to understand that we, at the end of the day, employers still need people with the right attitudes. And we also need to make sure that we do our job in terms of being brutal and honest with people to say to them, listen, your attitude sucks. You know, you need to do better. I mean, equally so, Mr. Speaker, we also have to recognize that there are some families that we have left behind. And we also have to recognize that the importation of cheap labor has had a significant impact on the Cayman economy in the sense of the people that we have brought here. So while I do understand, Mr. Speaker, that this is a transitionary bill, what I would ask the government to consider as they are now embarking on this road, recognizing that it is the start of a journey, is that we have a lot of work to do in terms of shaping the attitudes of people and also to some extent changing the Caymanian culture with regards to work. Barring my colleague from Georgetown Central, every single member in this chamber is old enough to know when we had the Caymanian Protection Board. And Mr. Speaker, of all the bills that was presented to this House, this one actually took the most time out of me to actually think about. And I can tell you, as I went back and I started doing research, I can tell you the more research you come across and the more articles you see, you realize that it becomes a vexing, emotive issue. I can tell you, I mean, I came across one article that was written by a new Caymanian. I had nothing good to say about Caymanians, and I just basically wondering, you know, how did this man even get status? I came across an article that was written by a Caymanian, and, you know, basically, you know, talk about all the failures of the political leadership and everything else over the years. And it's very easy, Mr. Speaker, for us to go back and cast blame. But I'm always mindful of the fact that when decisions are made, we make it with the information that we have, and that hindsight is always 20/20. I can always look back and say, well, the government should have done this and the government have done that when I have the benefit of, you know, what has happened since. But we don't have that luxury. When I ran, I knew we had a lot of problems in this country. Some started long before my time. But I didn't run to lay blame. I run to become 1/19 the owner of the problems in this country and 1/19 of the owner of finding a solution to the problems. You know, the government doesn't have an easy job. I can tell anybody that. You know, and as I look through the various laws, and this is one of the things that had really got me, Mr. Speaker. When I look at the employment law, it is Employment Law 2004. A lot of change since then. When you look at the labor law, It is 2011. It started from 1987, with the last one being in 2011. Things have changed since. But when I look at immigration law, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's one piece of legislation in this House that have had more changes, too much to even list or to even call out in this passage, just to show you, in essence, that we have been trying to find a magic bullet for immigration. And the truth of the fact is there will be no magic bullet. Because as cultures change, as norms change, people perception will change at the time. And one of the things that we ourselves as political leaders have to resist is the urge to become that populist, to cater to people's fear because it will get us votes. You know, it is one of the most tempting things, because everyone in this House knows what it is to campaign. They know what it is to walk around, beg votes, get doors slammed in your face, and people tell you what they have to tell you. It is not an easy job. And we just need to make sure that we're not too keen in trying our best to keep our jobs that we somehow forget to do our job. So with that said, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Premier, you'll be very happy, I'm actually going to be discussing the aspects of the bill and that has been proposed, and basically just kind of touch on a few things that I would like the government to consider as they embark on this ambitious but much needed program. On page 3, one of the things I'm very happy to see is where it says, in addition to the duties of work, will be responsibility for the training and development of Caymanians and of prescribed persons for the labor force. That, Mr. Speaker, is key. Because one of the things that we have done, which I think is an injustice to our people, is we gave them this whole idea that businesses must train and develop Caymanian. Businesses never that responsibilities from day one. If they want to be a good corporate citizen, we can thank them for it. But the truth of the fact is, businesses were not incorporated to train and develop Caymanians. That is our job as a people and as a government and as representative of those people, to ensure that we have an education system and a health system to make sure that we have the right population to meet the future needs of our country. One of the things I can say to you, Mr. Speaker, that jumped out at me when I was at HSBC, we had one particular position that, for whatever reason, it was a revolving door. We couldn't get somebody there past a month for the simple fact, within the first week, they were losing us money. And we just decided we couldn't continue. So we decided we were going to create a test for that particular position. And there was one candidate that always busybody, always have an opinion on everything. He applied, and we gave him the test. Mr. Speaker, the fact that I can still remember that test, the thing that jumped out at me the most is we had around 15 questions. And this particular candidate decided to change some of the questions, wrote his own questions in, and even when he answered them, they were wrong. That really got me thinking. And to this day, I still have a copy of that test. Even when the bank closed, I told him I'm holding on to that test. So any day I'm on the radio and that person calls, and I'm just going to say, I still have a copy of your test. You know? But it said something to me at that time, because I remember calling the person up and having a conversation with them about not having the job. And I was a little bit shocked at their approach, demanding that, oh, they're going to get it, they're going to call this one, they're going to call that one, and, you know, HSBC this and HSBC that. And it really kind of took me for a curve, because I expected something different from that person. Equally so, Mr. Speaker, we also have to accept that in some cases, we as a people have also dropped the ball. I mean, I look, for example, at Health City. I mean, you look at the hotels that are coming online. Many of us in here were probably at the groundbreaking, so we knew the hospital was being built. At that moment, it was an opportunity for us to start putting the proper requisite training programs to make sure that while we may not be able to get the doctors, a lot of the other different positions, we should be in a position that by the time construction was finished, at least our people should have been halfway or three-quarter qualified. We know probably maybe 1, 2 hotels are also in the making. I mean, these are hotels that require easily 200, 300, 400 people. You know, these are the kind of things that we need to make sure from now that we can go within the school, start identifying different positions from now, and get those kids trained up. Because, Mr. Speaker, we have an economy that, luckily for us, even though we have 1,000 kids coming to school roughly every year, our unemployment rate isn't as bad. And we are in the favorable position of at least having more jobs than we do Caymanians. So at least I can probably say we have jobs at least for the next 20 years if we invest in our people. So we're not in a bad position. We just need to make sure that we train our people and develop them to basically take those opportunities as they come due. I am keen to find out more, Mr. Speaker, of the clearinghouse that was mentioned on the government side, because I'm curious to see how that would work. I think it's a good idea. I know some people in the media may be upset because that's a big source of revenues for them. But, you know, like with anything, as my friend from East End said, time marches on. And I think a lot of people have made a good amount of money from advertising work permits in this country. What I would like...
You got some nice words for you tonight.
Hmm?
You got some nice words for you tonight.
No, well, that's all right. This is fine.
Salvageable,
No. The thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, we have enough things that we can have political differences on. But creating an atmosphere for Caymanians to benefit and get their piece of the Caymanian pie can't be one of the things we have political differences on. Because at the end of the day, we still have a responsibility, every single one of us, regardless of where we sit, to improve the quality of life for our people. Mr. Speaker, I want to close on just one brief contribution. And one of the things I will say to many people when they come to me speaking about wanting to get involved in politics, I ask them to do one thing. I said, there is a nice video on YouTube with Michael Manley. I think it's around 76, 77, that he did in New York while he was visiting the United Nations. And if you listen to that interview, there's no way you could come back from it not being a fan of Michael Manley, for the simple fact that he was clairvoyant, he was articulate, and he was ahead of his time with the issues. Back then, they were literally in the middle of the Cold War, and he was speaking about globalization and everything, things that weren't even an issue, but he literally had a crystal ball to see a lot of the issues. And then the second interview I asked people to watch is the one he did a year after he left office and a year before he died. And in a nutshell, the reporter asked him, how could he have gotten everything so right in theory, but everything went so wrong? And he said he learned 3 lessons. 1, he used language that frightened the business people and investors away, feel that he needed to invest in his country and create jobs. 2, he used language that frightened the middle class, that resulted in the biggest brain drain Jamaica ever saw, that up to the time of the interview he still regretted. And 3, he overestimated the political awareness of the Jamaican people. He thought that they could see what he was trying to do. And I say to my colleagues in this honorable house, let us not take anything for granted that people can assume every single thing. There are Caymanian families that are struggling. There are Caymanian families that are hurting. And one of the things I've found, Mr. Speaker, in my own personal experience, is the mismatch of the issues versus the mismatch of the priorities. And I say that to say, we look at the issue of unemployment, and generally speaking, there are 4 broad areas of unemployment. We have frictional unemployment, and that is normally short. You could have kids in school today, and they're not in the workforce, so they're not considered unemployed. But they graduate, the next week they start looking resumes and send out, they're now looking jobs, they have entered the workforce, they're unemployed. So it's that time in between where it takes someone to go from not looking to looking, or it could be someone in between their very contracts. We then also have seasonal unemployment, which I think is quite self-explanatory. Then we look at the construction industry, we look at the hotel industry. And those have high season, low seasons, and that's that. We also have what we call cyclical unemployment, which relates to like recessions, depressions in the economy, when things just a general slowdown in the economy. And those three, Mr. Speaker, are normally short in nature, and you can get around them. But the most challenging of all the unemployment, Mr. Speaker, is structural unemployment. That is the one where people will come unemployed due to advances in technology or jobs moving away, offices being relocated. And we need to make sure that when we do put policies in place, we recognize which of the issue that we're actually dealing with to make sure that whatever policy we have target the issue at the time. Because it makes no use you trying to deal with something seasonal, unemployment, when in fact the challenge is actually something more structural in nature, where we need to retrain and redevelop our people. What I would also ask the government to consider, Mr. Speaker, is the cost of some work permits in areas where Caymanian labor is readily available. Some permits in this country is too cheap. I've seen it being on a member of the Business Staff and Plan Board. I think some jobs should be reserved for our kids as entry-level positions coming out. And I saw many cases of abuses, especially within the tourism industry, in that regard. But equally so, we have to also say to our young people, they need to have the right attitude coming out of school. Because I've run into some of them, and one of the things I used to do, Mr. Speaker, in my role as a senior manager, I would go by the security and I would sit down and watch these people as they come in for interview. And a simple little thing as saying good morning to the security guard, or just being pleasant. I've sat down and I've had conversations with people who I'm going to interview, and they didn't even take the time out to even do their research to find out who's going to interview them. And they would sit down and tell me things like, boy, I don't really want this job, but boy, I got little bills to pay, and And then a person would come and they'll call me, say, Mr. Saunders, I'll go inside there, sit in the room. Then the person would come in, and then they'll realize they were already talking to the person who was going to interview them. And I remember one person just said, I'm not going to get this job, am I? I'm like, nope, you're not going to get it. So these are the kind of things that we need to consider. But more importantly, I am happy to see that the government has recognized that change in the immigration isn't going to solve this problem. What we do need is a structural approach to a structural problem. And it starts by changing the entire structure of the way we do business. There are other issues within the bill, which I think we can probably touch within the committee stage. And as I said in a previous speech last week, it's good if we can start sitting down, even ahead of even coming to this house, and even from a bipartisan standpoint, to start airing out some of these issues. Because it's very easy to grandstand in this house to get the sound bites and to get the media coverage and everything else. But at the end of the day, it still doesn't put one Caymanian to work. And gentlemen and ladies, we all have work to do. And it's time now for us to get to work. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will close with my contribution, and thank you all.
Is there any other member wishing to speak? Is there any other member wishing to speak? Call now on the Premier to wind up. Sarge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank all members who have spoken. on this important bill, which is being brought to effect the transition, or I should say, to begin the transition of a number of the current immigration functions, certainly as they relate to the workforce and to the grant of permanent residence and Caymanian status or the right to be Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, generally, I thought the speeches were constructive, with one notable exception. Mr. Speaker, I would ask the member from Bordentown West if he would ensure that a copy of that YouTube interview with the late Michael Manley, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, be sent to the member from Georgetown Central. And I join voice with the member from Bordentown West in urging the member from Georgetown Central to view it probably more than once. For Mr. Speaker, populism is now a very popular thing. But those of us who are charged with responsibility for administering the affairs of this country and who have the honor and privilege of sitting in this House need to be able to distinguish between campaign and representation. We are now working assiduously to address the issues, or that's what we ought to be doing, to address the issues that we campaigned about, to improve the lot of the people in this country, and to improve the fortunes of this country. And any of us who believes that the fortunes of this country depend upon only the contribution of Caymanians don't even begin to understand how we got to where we are. Yes, only Caymanians can vote. But you want to see something? We've seen it recently. You let there be a significant exodus of the foreigners who are here and see who supports the businesses, who does a lot of the work that Caymanians won't do, and see how many Caymanians lose their jobs as a result. Mr. Speaker, the important bit that the member from Georgetown Central simply does not grasp in terms of basic economics, in terms of employment and employment opportunities for our people, is that without the proper economic environment, there just are not jobs for anyone to do. There are not opportunities, economic opportunities, for our own people to grasp. Nor does he appear, Mr. Speaker, to understand that all of the many social programs and subsidies which he strongly advocates on behalf of the people, of the Caymanian people, nor does he seem to understand that they have to be funded, and that that funding has to come from somewhere. So when you denigrate those who create the revenue, contribute to the revenue, when you slam every single capital project that the government attempts, when you work hard to stop things like the development of a cruise port and the redevelopment of the cargo port. You are, Mr. Speaker, literally taking the bread out of the mouths, in his case, of his own constituents, because this is in the district, the constituency of Georgetown Central. You can't, on the one hand, condemn development, entrepreneurial attempts by many people, lambast the business community, do everything in your power to discourage growth and development of the economy, and then do what he has done and has sworn he's going to continue to do, working to protect Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, it might sound good to the ears of some Caymanians, that boy is fighting for us. But, Mr. Speaker, I have no doubt that his heart is in the right place.
Thank you very much.
But his head is definitely in the wrong one. And, Mr. Speaker, you got to get your head right first, because your heart can want all the things in the world, but if you don't do the right things, no point in your heart hurting, no point in your having so much compassion and empathy, because you will do what that member has done so far in the 18 months he has been here and not achieved one single thing for the people whom he loves and whom have elected him. Mr. Speaker, on the other hand, when the government brings a bill like this, instead of doing what all other members of the opposition have done that spoke, and I believe the one member who didn't speak would share their views because I know him very well, is that they said philosophically, we endorse what the government is seeking to do. They are at this point and that point and the other point, and we hope and so forth. That's quite proper. But they did not spend the time that they were on their feet complaining about all of the things that don't make the bill perfect. Mr. Speaker, the bill is far from perfect. I said from the beginning that this is a necessary step now because we need to move the transitional process forward. And there are more things to come. But even with all of those, it still won't be perfect. And the system still won't be perfect. But, Mr. Speaker, here is what the governments, plural, that I have had the honor and privilege to lead have managed to achieve in the 5.5 years since I was sworn in as Premier. We have moved unemployment from 9.8% for Caymanians in 10.5% for Caymanians in the fall of 2012 to 5.3% in the last ESO exercise. That's for Caymanians. And overall, unemployment has gone from 6.2 in 2012 to 3.4 in the last ESO exercise earlier this year. And all indications are, Mr. Speaker, that when the next ESO exercise is completed and the statistics published, overall unemployment will be well below what is known as structural unemployment, and most importantly, Caymanian unemployment will have fallen well below 5%. Now, there are few places in this world that are able to say that. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the difference between the kind of railing that the member from Georgetown Central who came here 5 minutes ago carried on about, and what a mature government which understands what the issues are and works assiduously every day to address them does. While that member bangs on and on and on talk show after talk show about all the things that are wrong in this country, this government does the things to try to make those wrongs right. That is the difference, Mr. Speaker, between leadership and mouth championship. That, Mr. Speaker, is the difference. Mr. Speaker, the member mentioned the numbers of people in the NICE program. Let me tell him a little bit again about the difference between complaining and working and achieving and whining. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in the year 2015, 752 Caymanians or permanent residents turned up to register at the NICE program at Christmas. In 2016, 588. In 2017, 600, roughly. They said 600, but I'm sure the number is not exact. In the summer of 2018, this year, 480. And today, we don't have the exact numbers yet, but they're certainly less than 400. So, Mr. Speaker, all the indicators are that the trajectory is right. Economic opportunities, employment opportunities have increased and are increasing, and most importantly, Caymanian take-up of those opportunities is also increasing. Mr. Speaker, the member from Georgetown Central complained about the lack of assistance that government provides to people who are Caymanians who are in need of training and upskilling. Mr. Speaker, we've got the Passport to Success program, which pays participants while they get training, provides childcare, and subsidizes salaries of employers who qualify, paid by employers who qualify. We've got the Ready to Work Cayman program. We've got the Hospitality Training School, which has within it a school of bartending, housekeeping, and entry-level management. We have the relatively new Public Works Apprenticeship program, and now courses on boat handling. As an example of on-the-ground available programs for Caymanians who wish to seize these opportunities. Mr. Speaker, that is not including the more than $13 million a year government is spending on scholarships, both for overseas schools as well as University College here. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to get to a point when we say not the words that you know your constituents want to say because, yeah, man, he's looking out for me. When we say, Caymanians, there are these opportunities you need to grasp them with both hands. There is only so much that government or your representative can do. We give you the opportunity, we give you the encouragement, and we are putting in place, and that is part of what the work program, the work regime is about, putting in place systems which not only help to coordinate some of these programs and to fill deficits which may otherwise still remain, but also encourages fairness in treatment of Caymanians in the job opportunity space. Mr. Speaker, if I or the government had believed that the system that we had was working okay, you think we would have gone through all of this? All of the trauma that is involved in change management? Mr. Speaker, the government is trying really, really hard to get that balance right, to set, and I think we have succeeded, to set the country on a firm economic foundation, one where confidence abounds and people are prepared to invest, to open businesses, to expand businesses. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that there still remains a certain level of discrimination and prejudice in some quarters about what Caymanians can, should, will be allowed to do as employees. And, Mr. Speaker, not content with this, we are developing the Fair Employment Opportunities Commission. I had hoped that we would have gotten that legislation here this year. That's not happened. There's just too many other things competing for the legislative drafting resources. But if God spares life, and all things being equal, we'll get it here next year. Mr. Speaker, this government is sincere about doing everything we can to provide our people, particularly our young people, but not just them, with the opportunities which a place like Cayman, with the strong economic circumstances that we enjoy, should permit its own people to have. And so, Mr. Speaker, if I were younger in this business, I would perhaps be rather disillusioned this evening, having heard what the young member from Georgetown Central had to say about the government's efforts so far. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, he might think he moves around more than Alden McLaughlin, but he got to be good to do that. And I promise you, Mr. Speaker, that I know, not because anybody tell me, but I know from my interaction with my people and his people in Georgetown Central, because he should never forget that I represented Georgetown Central for 16 years. And not many people there I don't know. I know that all across this beautiful little country of ours, most people are upbeat about their fortunes. People feel better about their circumstances. They have more money in their pocket. And I know he struggles with that, because the opportunities to beat the government for not doing this and not providing this opportunity and that job get less and less with each passing quarter. And, Mr. Speaker, I have more bad news for him. All of the indications are that next year, all things being equal, is likely to be an even better year economically for these islands than this year has been. So, Mr. Speaker, enough attention on that member. Mr. Speaker, I want to again thank the leader and deputy leader of the opposition for their support and the member for Georgetown, for Bordentown West of the bill. A number of points were raised which I would like to see if I can clarify. The certificate of need, which I think was raised by the member from East End, or the member from North Side, the leader of the opposition, sorry, Mr. Speaker. With the establishment of the labor needs and supply unit at work, it is anticipated that there will be improved visibility of labor supply and needs within industries to inform decision making. The leader of the opposition used the example of the profession of dentistry. Once systems and processes are in place, work will have the capacity to gather labor market information and provide such analysis to direct decisions and assist the government in achieving full employment. Mr. Speaker, there was a suggestion also by the leader of the opposition about board appointments and a suggestion that we should adopt provisions similar to those in the Public Authorities Law with respect to how we canvass for board members and how we appoint them. Mr. Speaker, we're happy to consider that and see where we get to. Obviously, we're not going to make that decision tonight or in committee stage. We still have other iterations of this bill to bring, or so we can consider that in the context of other changes which are proposed. The business staffing plans, scholarship requirements. Mr. Speaker, we support that recommendation for consideration for the Scholarship Secretariat to manage and oversee the eligibility criteria. So we will explore this with the Minister of Education to determine feasibility and capacity with respect to this. The government supports efforts to minimize duplication of efforts, which is occurring quite a bit now. The National Job Clearinghouse proposals have been received and are under consideration to publish a list of work permits expiring within the next 6 months. So we're trying to put in place a system that when 6 months before a permit comes up for a renewal, that it's flagged so that we can deal with it. On job descriptions, I am happy to report that the proposed way forward is to use standard ISO codes to synchronize with ESO and the National Job Clearinghouse. The Labor Supply Needs Unit, as I indicated earlier, the IT systems of work are still being considered and developed, and it is anticipated that data analysis capacity and reporting will be greatly enhanced to improve decision making. With respect to the regulation of job placement agencies, Mr. Speaker, I have already requested that my ministry explore the challenges that surround these concerns and work to develop proposals for consideration, which will bring a greater balance to all parties concerned. Quite frankly, we don't want to regulate these agencies out of existence, but there is considerable evidence to show that the processes which they adopt are being abused, or are abusive, I should say. Mr. Speaker, the point raised by my colleague from East End my ancient friend. No, I didn't say my erstwhile friend, I said my ancient friend. That's different. Mr. Speaker, the member from East End's proposal, really with respect to the right to be Caymanian or Caymanian status, if the government were to adopt that, it would essentially remove completely the whole premise on which the process of obtaining a work permit, serving 8 years, having the ability to apply for permanent residence, then moving on to naturalization and the right to be Caymanian. The whole graduate system of graduated integration, which is the underlying premise of the legislation, would have to go. Mr. Speaker, I was around and involved from the onset of this, much condemned, very controversial so-called rollover policy was put in place. So I understand what the thinking was from the very beginning. It's been refined over the course of many years, and I think that most people now accept it as the best arrangement that we have ever come up with to avoid the problems that had plagued us for many, many years. And I am all ears and most willing to listen to anyone who comes up with a better system. Because here is the situation which drove the development of the rollover policy, the term limit policy in the first place, have been exacerbated since then by the sheer number of people who are here on work permit. Essentially what drove the thinking in 2001, when this exercise first began, was that had been in place a moratorium on the grants of Caymanian status, which was determined by the courts eventually to be unlawful, and therefore that had been lifted. We had people who were here, in some cases, I know an extreme case of someone here 35 years. The one I know about was 35 years with no form of security of tenure. And we were under increased pressure from the United Kingdom and locally from our own various agents, entities, advocates in Cayman, that it was just grossly unfair to have people here living from permit to permit for extended periods of time, who put down roots, who grew families here, and there was no possibility, it seemed, for them to be able to obtain some kind of security of tenure. So that was one argument, one side of the argument. On the other side of the argument, with the views of many people, many Caymanians, is that everybody who comes here can't be allowed to stay here indefinitely, and nobody should have that expectation. So over time and much discussion, what was adopted was a term limit arrangement, which initially was 7 years, which we said if you can't get a permit renewed beyond 7 years, at year 6 you can apply for permanent residence. If you get it, you can stay and then move on to naturalization and Caymanian status. If you don't, you roll out of the system and you have to go back home or go somewhere else. That period was increased, the term limit, to 9, which is the system that we have now. So the premise is, Mr. Speaker, the premise still is, you can get permits renewed assuming that there is work for you and there's not a Caymanian who can take your job up until year 9, then no more. At year 8, you can apply for permanent residence. If you meet the criteria, you get the necessary 110 points, you get permanent residence. If you don't get the 110 points, you're out of here. If you get permanent residence, you behave yourself in I think it is in 3 years. If you're granted permanent residence, you will have met the primary requirement to be able to apply for naturalization as a British Overseas Territorial citizen, namely that you are free from immigration restriction as to the length of time you may remain in the islands. Then you must meet other residence requirements. You must have lived here for at least 5 years if your spouse is not a British Overseas Territorial citizen, or 3 years if your spouse is a British Overseas Territorial citizen. Then you may apply for the right to be Caymanian on grounds of naturalization, either 5 years after being naturalized or 15 years of residence, whichever is earlier. So, Mr. Speaker, the system is designed so that you either get rolled out of it at year 9, or if you get permanent residence, you have then a path to becoming Caymanian over time. It's deliberately designed that way. So it would take a complete rethink to change that. I don't see how we can really tinker around the edges with that without really destroying the fundamental premise upon which that part of the legislation is actually constructed. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's working well. I really do. I'm not hearing huge complaints about the permanent residence thing anymore. I can tell you that it's a relatively, I think, a reasonable percentage of those who apply actually get it. I think that the system has settled down to a point now where people are not making applications just to be able to stay here, even though they know they'll never meet the criteria, because they get considered quickly enough. They know they're going to lose their $1,000 and whatever else it is. So we're not getting those, I can't call them frivolous, because they had real intent in putting them in, because the system was, when the system was grinding so slowly, it would take years for your applications to get dealt with. Now they know they're going to get dealt with in a matter of months, so people are not wasting time and money doing it. So at this stage, the government really has no inclination to trouble that aspect of the law. We will continue to work to improve the processes, make them more efficient and effective and transparent. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I have covered the points that I thought we should respond to. We should respond to. And, Mr. Speaker, there will be, some would say unfortunately, but there will be further opportunities to debate these issues again, because, as I say, this is a transition bill. We hope, certainly by this time next year, that we will have had the whole framework properly in place, and that we can settle in to this, under this new system, which we believe will deliver better results across the board for Caymanians who are seeking employment and training, and for those who utilize the work permit process, and for those who apply for permanent residence and Caymanian status. So, Mr. Speaker, I commend the bill to the House and seek its safe passage.
If I could speak, I would say I agree. there is an upbeat chorus we sing in song, very, 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 very upbeat. It says, things already better. Having said that, the question is that a bill entitled the Immigration Transition Bill 2018 be given a second reading. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, could I have a, I thought I heard a no somewhere. Could I have a division, sir?
Clerk, divide.
I started.
Honourable Alder McLaughlin.
Aye.
Honourable Moses Kirkconnell.
Aye.
Honourable Juliana O'Connor Connolly. Honourable Dwayne Seymour.
Aye.
Honourable Roy Taggart.
Aye.
Honourable Joseph Hugh.
Aye.
Honourable Tara Rivers.
Aye.
Honourable Barney Bush.
Aye.
Captain Eugene Ebanks.
Aye.
Ms. Barbara Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. David White.
Aye.
Mr. Austin Harris.
Aye.
Honourable Ezra Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Anthony Eden.
Aye.
Mr. Christopher Saunders.
Yes.
Mr. Orden McLean.
Uh-huh. Yes.
The results of the division. 17 ayes, 1 absentee. The chair is always willing to agree to good things government has been doing. The bill, therefore, is given a second reading. Honorable Premier, I think we reached that hour. Order. Premier.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I briefly entertained thoughts of continuing because there was indications of general agreement on the next bill, but then I heard some things there which I think might lead us into a much later night than I would like. Mr. Speaker, I move the adjournment of this Honorable House until 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the 21st.
The question is that this Honorable House do now adjourn until 10 a.m. on Wednesday. Those against? Those aye? The House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning, God willing.